For the last 6 months, I've been working on my own NFT project that I believe is going to change the game. Really fun game that makes you money.
A fun game that earns you money. How much did you guys make from CryptoZoo?
I lost around $50,000 in CryptoZoo.
I lost $40,000.
I lost around 15,000 US dollars.
I lost $25,000.
$120,000.
$500,000 Australian, which is $500,000 in CryptoZoo.
Shut up! No, you haven't!
Yeah, 500K.
Oh.
People don't go this far trying to keep something buried without a reason. When someone applies that kind of pressure, it usually points to something happening behind the scenes. And that's exactly the feeling surrounding this situation right now. This lawsuit looked like it was supposed to be Logan Paul's reset moment, the point where everything shifts back in his favor and the criticism starts to fade. A comeback, a cleaner image, control of the narrative again. But instead of that smooth return, things have started moving in the opposite direction. Now it's turning into one of the more uncomfortable chapters tied to his name, and not because of a new controversy or a sudden leak. The bigger issue is this: Logan is trying to keep his own sworn testimony out of public view. That alone changes how people look at everything connected to this case. When someone with that level of influence pushes this hard to keep information sealed, it doesn't go unnoticed. It leads to a simple question: what was actually said when the cameras were off and the pressure was real? This whole situation began when Logan filed a defamation lawsuit against Coffeezilla.
So like I said in my last video, Logan Paul filed this motion to preserve confidentiality so that he can mark his entire deposition as confidential. This would effectively mean that Coffeezilla can't share this deposition or any of the contents within it with anyone outside his legal team, and he could only use it for purposes of litigating this defamation lawsuit. For starters, this kind of a request to mark the entire deposition as confidential is not normal.
The strategy likely seemed straightforward: apply legal pressure, quiet the criticism, and regain control of the narrative. On paper, it looks calculated and controlled. But instead of calming things down, it had the opposite effect. The pressure built, it led to a formal deposition, and now there's a strong push to make sure that transcript or footage never becomes public. Not just parts of it, the entire thing. No edits, no selective releases, no controlled clips. The goal appears to be full lockdown, with every answer and every exchange kept out of sight.
Root problem. He doesn't make any argument that anything in the deposition is sensitive or private in nature. In other words, he doesn't really make any real arguments as to why this entire deposition should be treated as confidential.
That's where things start to stand out. Usually, when someone asks for that level of secrecy, they point to something specific: private details, sensitive information, or unrelated individuals who need protection. Something concrete. That doesn't seem to be happening here. No exact section was identified, no detailed explanation was provided, and nothing specific was clearly pointed out. It comes across as a broad request to keep everything hidden, and that kind of approach naturally draws attention. Logan's legal team argues that Coffeezilla shouldn't be trusted with access to the deposition.
Paul's argument that Coffeezilla failed to essentially try to work things out with him before resorting to the official objection process here. Like I said in my last video, if it's clear early on that going back and forth in the meet and confer process is just going to be a total waste of time, Coffeezilla isn't required to keep engaging with Logan Paul. And here, Coffeezilla says trying to meet and confer with Paul was totally futile because Paul made this blanket designation of confidentiality over the entire deposition. And Coffeezilla throws some shade here when he says by filing his motion without conferring with Coffeezilla, Paul incontestably signaled his desire simply to suppress anything depicting him in a less than flattering, i.e. not self-produced light.
They suggest it could be shared, passed between legal teams, or even given to investigators. And they present that as a serious concern. But when you look closer, that argument starts to lose strength. None of those actions are automatically improper. Legally obtained discovery doesn't have to stay private forever, and there's no blanket rule stopping it from being discussed or brought to authorities if necessary. So simply not wanting sworn testimony to be public isn't enough on its own to justify sealing everything. That's where the situation starts to feel more complicated. Coffeezilla's legal team pushes back on that directly. Their position is clear: unless the deposition contains genuinely sensitive material, there's no strong reason to keep it hidden from public view. They also make it clear that contradictions alone aren't grounds for secrecy. If Logan made statements that don't align, that doesn't justify sealing it. If he avoided certain questions or gave unclear answers, that doesn't automatically support keeping it private either. And if his own testimony weakened his position, that's part of why depositions exist.
Coffeezilla then addresses Paul's next argument, the one where Paul complains about Coffeezilla sharing information with the FBI and with the CryptoZoo class action plaintiffs. And then Coffeezilla says, regardless, disclosing information to the FBI is a lawful use of discovery materials and is not prohibited by the protective order.
That's where this becomes more difficult for Logan. He doesn't appear to be arguing that the deposition exposes private details about others. His focus is on how it reflects on him. That distinction matters because it shifts the issue away from privacy and toward personal exposure. Coffeezilla's lawyers lean into that point. They argue that Logan hasn't provided a solid, good faith reason to seal the deposition. No clearly identified section, no detailed justification, no specific explanation that supports a request this broad. Instead, it reads like one sweeping demand: hide everything and keep the entire record out of sight. And that kind of approach doesn't align with how courts typically handle requests like this.
Starters, Coffeezilla essentially says, hey, pot calling the kettle black much? Logan Paul's lawyer sent a detailed letter on December 1st, 2025 to the FBI, making his own accusations against Coffeezilla and explicitly referring to material he obtained in discovery in the case, including emails and phone calls.
At that point, it starts to feel less like protection and more like an attempt to limit fallout. Because if the deposition clearly helped his side, there likely wouldn't be this kind of effort to keep it hidden. People don't usually fight this hard to bury something that works in their favor. They use it, highlight it, and point to it as support. Here, though, the focus shifts in the opposite direction. Keep it sealed and out of public view. That contrast stands out for a reason. A deposition isn't something you can reshape later like online content. There's no editing, no polishing, and no control over how answers come across in the moment. It's direct, under oath, and every response carries weight. If that transcript ever becomes public, it won't come with framing or spin. It will simply be his exact words, exactly as they were said on record. So when there's this much effort going into keeping it hidden, it leads to one key question. What actually happened in that testimony?
In the protective order that restricts the use or disclosure of non-confidential information. And so here's where I think Coffeezilla lays down some strong hints as to what it is that Logan Paul is so afraid of getting out from his deposition. Here, Coffeezilla says, the mere fact that Paul comes off poorly in his deposition is no basis to keep the entire transcript confidential. If, for example, Paul was evasive during his deposition or admitted to making misrepresentations, which would support Coffeezilla's defense of truth, of course, that is no basis to keep his deposition hidden from the public. And if Paul's testimony contains evidence that a crime has been committed, not only will that testimony not be confidential under either the protective order or any common law definition of confidential, but it would be contrary to the public interest to shield it from law enforcement.
And this is only the beginning. Once you start going through the filings, the arguments don't become more convincing. They begin to lose strength. And that's where it starts to feel like there's a bigger concern sitting underneath all of this. Logan's next claim brings in another angle. He argues that Coffeezilla has been sharing case-related information with the FBI, and based on that, says he shouldn't be trusted with access to the deposition at all. But when you slow down and really examine that logic, it starts to break down pretty quickly. The argument, at its core, suggests that if someone might bring potential evidence to federal investigators, then they shouldn't be allowed to access or even talk about discovery materials. It may sound serious at first, but legally, it doesn't come across as especially convincing. Unless there's a clear court order restricting it, sharing lawfully obtained information with law enforcement is allowed. In some situations, it's not just acceptable, it's expected. Coffeezilla's legal team points this out directly.
It's a response to Paul's argument about sharing information with the CryptoZoo class action plaintiffs as well. Specifically, he says, Paul also suggests Coffeezilla is improperly sharing confidential information with counsel in the class action, citing a YouTube video in which class action plaintiffs counsel claims Paul's defamation case was helpful to the class action case. Paul omitted from his motion what class action counsel found so helpful,
arguing that if discovery reveals signs of possible fraud or misconduct, taking that information to authorities isn't improper. It can serve the public interest. And this is where things start to turn, because that same line of reasoning begins to circle back on Logan himself. During this case, his own legal team also reached out to the FBI, and they did so using discovery materials. That's where the argument starts to lose balance. If one side can communicate with investigators while the other is criticized for it, it doesn't come across as a consistent position. It starts to feel less like a solid legal argument and more like a double standard. At that point, the focus shifts. It feels less about fairness and more about concern over where this could lead. Because the real issue doesn't appear to be the FBI's involvement, it's what they might find if they take a closer look. From there, the argument moves into another area, the protective order. Logan claims that one is already in place and suggests that Coffeezilla stepped outside of it by sharing information beyond the case. On the surface, that sounds serious, but when you actually look at the order itself, that claim doesn't fully hold up. A protective order isn't meant to lock everything down by default. It applies to specific categories, information that is genuinely private, sensitive, or confidential by definition.
Third argument basically says that Coffeezilla hasn't indicated any imminent need to file any portion of Paul's deposition transcript. And he says Coffeezilla also hasn't explained how designating the deposition as confidential otherwise impacts Coffeezilla's ability to litigate the case. But that's not a reason to mark evidence as confidential.
Coffeezilla's legal team explains this clearly. The order doesn't say that all discovery must stay within the case. It only applies to material that meets a defined level of confidentiality outlined in the document. And here's where another gap becomes clear. There's no reference to any part of the deposition that actually fits that definition. Not a page, not a section, not a concrete example showing why it should be sealed. Instead, the request stays broad. Seal everything without distinction. But courts don't usually operate on general claims like that. They expect specifics, and those specifics don't appear to be provided here. Then another point gets added into the mix. Logan argues that Coffeezilla shared discovery materials with lawyers connected to the Crypto Zoo class action lawsuit, framing it as misuse of the legal process. But that argument starts to lose strength when you look at the context. When multiple cases involve the same project, similar claims, and overlapping parties, sharing non-confidential material isn't unusual. In fact, it's a normal part of how these situations move forward. Cases like this aren't rare either. They happen regularly, especially when much of the information is already public. And that's part of what makes this stand out even more.
List of categories for protection, and looking at how in his motion, Logan Paul doesn't claim that any of the information triggers any kind of privacy right, whether that's his or some third party. Again, unless I'm missing something really important here that, it happens as much as I hate when it does, I don't see anything in this motion that tells me, yeah, there's some reason to keep this confidential. So at the end of the day, I'm thinking this is pretty likely that it's going to be denied and that the deposition is likely to get shared. And I'll just say, if this deposition does find its way to the internet, I, for one, would be very interested in watching the playback.
A key detail that often gets overlooked is that much of what Logan is pointing to was already publicly available. Court filings, official records, documents that anyone can access without restriction. So the idea that private material was quietly leaked doesn't fully line up with what's actually there. When you step back and look at everything together, a pattern starts to form. This doesn't really feel like an effort focused on protecting sensitive information. It comes across more like an attempt to slow things down before they become harder to manage. Because if that deposition connects to other cases or highlights differences between public statements and sworn testimony, the situation becomes much more serious. And that's where the tone shifts again. If the deposition was harmless, there likely wouldn't be this level of urgency to keep it sealed. People don't usually push this hard for secrecy unless something is at stake. And when that level of effort shows up, it naturally raises one question: what could come out of it? At this stage, it starts moving beyond just a defamation case. It begins to look more like containment, an attempt to control how far this spreads and what impact it could have. And that's why this situation matters beyond a single lawsuit. If that deposition becomes public, it could influence other Crypto Zoo-related cases, shape public perception, and put pressure on Logan's image. Then another weaker point comes into focus. Logan argues that Coffeezilla hasn't shown any urgent need to make the deposition public, and from that suggests there's no reason for anyone else to see it. In simple terms, the idea is that if it's not urgently needed, it should stay hidden. But that reasoning doesn't really hold when you look at how court records work.
Coffeezilla is highlighting here is that we, you and me, the public, have a right to observe how our judicial system is operating, because the courts are a very important part of our government. Even though it's not criminal law, civil lawsuits still have a heavy ability to shape our lives and our society. And so we need to be able to have transparency in our courts to ensure that our First Amendment rights of petitioning the government and otherwise monitoring this government function are protected. And so any analysis of whether something should be kept confidential is going to need to balance those rights of the public with the interests of the person or the entity that is asking for privacy.
Access to court records isn't based on urgency, and it's not something the opposing side gets to approve or deny. Coffeezilla doesn't have to justify why the public should see it. The responsibility sits with Logan to clearly explain why it should be sealed, and that's exactly where the argument keeps losing strength. There's no clear definition of what qualifies as confidential, no specific page identified, and no exact line pointed out as sensitive. At the center of all this is still the same core issue, a broad request to keep everything out of public view. And that kind of approach doesn't align with how courts typically handle situations like this. It doesn't come across as a tightly built legal argument based on specifics, but more like an attempt to limit how closely the material can be examined, and that shift is hard to ignore. When people review these filings closely, they keep landing on the same conclusion. The arguments don't seem to meet the legal standard required to justify sealing something this significant. Courts don't restrict access to records just because someone feels exposed, and they don't hide sworn testimony simply because it might reflect poorly later, especially when transparency is expected to be part of the process. This is where things start to feel more layered, because the way Logan is handling this publicly doesn't fully match what's being argued in court. On one side, there's a push to keep everything confidential, while at the same time he's actively posting on YouTube, sharing his version, defending himself, and shaping how the story reaches millions of viewers. Those videos are pulling serious attention, which makes the contrast even harder to ignore. It starts to look like privacy matters more when the narrative isn't fully in his control, while going public becomes acceptable when he's the one framing the message. That kind of imbalance doesn't tend to hold for long, and it naturally raises questions about intent.
January 9th, Coffeezilla responded with his opposition to the motion to preserve confidentiality, and here he didn't disappoint. For starters, he said Logan Paul designated his entire deposition confidential, citing the court's confidentiality and protective order. That order allows a party to designate as confidential only such information that the party in good faith believes in fact is confidential. Paul has not provided, and indeed cannot provide, any good faith basis to keep his entire deposition confidential. Nor has he explained why any specific portions of his deposition are actually confidential, as that term is defined in the protection.
It's also important to remember that this situation didn't just appear out of nowhere. Logan had already addressed it publicly before in one of his apology videos, where he thanked Coffeezilla for bringing attention to the issues surrounding CryptoZoo and said he would fix things, promising refunds and stating that affected users would be paid back.
He's not a criminal. I called him, I apologize. Step 2, we want to offer a rewards program for players who are disappointed in the status of the game. So essentially you're going to be able to burn your base egg or your base animal for the mint price, which was 0.1 ETH or the equivalent in BNB. I am personally committing 1,000 ETH to this, which is about $1.3 million. I'm sorry, guys. I apologize for how this has unfolded thus far, and I want people to know that they can trust me and that I'll always take care of the fans and people who support me. And lastly, thank you, Coffeezilla. You have catalyzed this, and I am very grateful for your work and your investigation, and I mean that. Thank you.
Those weren't vague remarks. They were direct commitments made in front of a massive audience, setting a clear expectation that the situation would be resolved. But as time moved forward, that resolution didn't fully come together. Months passed, then even more time, and many people still haven't received their money back. That's a big reason this situation never really faded. That ongoing pressure is also what led to this lawsuit. Coffeezilla didn't appear randomly. He kept following the story, kept asking where the refunds were, and kept bringing attention back to those public promises that hadn't been fulfilled. Instead of fully resolving the issue or offering clear updates, Logan chose to file a lawsuit against the person continuing to question him, and that decision led directly to the deposition that is now being pushed out of public view. The key difference here is simple. A deposition isn't something you can shape like online content. There's no editing, no retakes, and no control over how answers come across in the moment. Everything is said under oath, and every word carries weight that can't be adjusted later. If that testimony clearly supported his position, it likely wouldn't be hidden. It would be shared, highlighted, and used to reinforce his side of the story. But instead, the focus has shifted toward keeping it sealed, and that shift hasn't gone unnoticed. Coffeezilla's legal team points this out directly, arguing that Logan hasn't provided a solid, good faith reason to justify sealing the deposition, since no specific sections have been identified, no clear explanation has been offered, and nothing detailed enough has been presented to meet the required standard. Because of that, the request comes across as overly broad rather than legally strong, and it continues to raise questions the longer it goes unanswered. When you look at the bigger picture, it starts to feel less like an effort to protect sensitive information and more like an attempt to protect an image, a brand, and a public reputation under pressure. There were multiple chances to handle this differently, especially when it came to the refund promises that were made publicly, but instead of being resolved quickly, the situation stretched into delays, long periods of silence, and pressure building over time. And now, if the court denies that request and the deposition becomes public, there's no way to reshape it afterward. No edits, no framing, no way to adjust how it sounds. It would simply be his own words, exactly as they were said, fully on record. So in the end, it comes down to one question. Does that change how the situation looks, or does it not really shift anything at all? And if you want to stay on top of how this unfolds, make sure you're subscribed. You don't want to miss what comes next.